After his wealthy wife passed away, her arrogant sons demanded the estate, the business, and absolutely everything else. His lawyer begged him to fight for his 25 years of marriage. But Arthur calmly replied to just give it all to them. Everyone thought the grieving husband had completely lost his mind. At the final hearing, Arthur quietly signed the transfer papers. The two stepsons smiled in triumph, right up until their lawyer turned pale when he read the final sentence. To understand how Arthur arrived at that moment of brilliant vengeance, one had to look back to the day the nightmare truly began. The day they buried his beloved Eleanor. The air at the cemetery was heavy with the suffocating scent of thousands of imported lilies and roses. Eleanor Pendleton had been a titan in the Massachusetts business world, the brilliant founder of a massive supply chain empire, and her funeral reflected her immense corporate status. Arthur stood slightly apart from the sprawling crowd of executives, politicians, and distant relatives. He wore a simple, slightly worn black suit, his weathered hands clasped respectfully in front of him. His eyes were dry. He shed no tears in front of these strangers, not from a lack of sorrow, but from a profound, exhausting grief that had left his soul entirely hollow. For 25 years, Arthur had been the quiet, unshakable foundation of the Pendleton household. A retired high school teacher, he had willingly sacrificed his own modest ambitions, living frugally and patiently managing the estate so Eleanor could focus on building her dynasty. He had raised her two boys, Rick and Tom, from their turbulent and arrogant teenage years, offering them the steady, forgiving guidance of a father figure they never appreciated. He had endured their constant sneers, their condescension, and their endless demands for money, all out of a deep, unwavering love for his wife. He had always believed that his limitless patience would eventually earn their respect. He was terribly wrong. Across the freshly turned earth of the gravesite, Rick and Tom were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Rick, dressed in a custom-tailored suit from New York that cost more than Arthur used to make in an entire year, wiped away imaginary tears while actively shaking hands with potential investors. Tom stood beside his glamorous, status-obsessed wife, Chloe, looking utterly devastated as he accepted condolences from Eleanor's wealthy business partners. The two brothers played the roles of heartbroken, devoted sons to absolute perfection. The naive guests whispered among themselves about how incredibly strong the boys were being during such a tragic time. They were completely blind to the dark, calculating reality hiding beneath that polished grief. But Arthur knew better. He watched their sharp eyes scan the mourning crowd, mentally cataloging who was important to their future wealth and who could be entirely ignored. The moment the final guest departed and the heavy wrought iron gates of the cemetery were closed, the sorrowful illusion immediately shattered. Later that evening, the sprawling $2.5 million mansion in Weston felt suffocatingly empty. The vibrant warmth that Eleanor always brought to the massive halls was completely gone. Arthur retreated to his small, modest study on the ground floor, desperately hoping for a single moment of quiet peace to process his monumental loss. The room was filled with his old teaching books and framed photographs of his travels with Eleanor. He had barely poured himself a cup of hot tea when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the quiet room. Before Arthur could even offer a response, the heavy wooden door swung violently open. Rick and Tom stepped inside, bringing a chilling energy with them. The sorrowful, weeping masks they had worn flawlessly all afternoon were completely gone, replaced by expressions of cold, predatory calculation. Rick did not offer a single word of comfort to the man who had helped raise him. He did not ask how Arthur was holding up. Instead, he just looked around the small, unassuming room with undisguised disgust, as if standing in a place beneath his dignity. Tom stepped up beside his older brother, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. His eyes were devoid of any human empathy. Rick locked his steely, aggressive gaze onto Arthur, his jaw clenched tight. The brief mourning period was officially over, and the ruthless hunt for Eleanor's empire had just begun. Rick did not come into the study to offer condolences. He stepped aside, allowing a third man to enter the small room. It was Charles Sterling, a high-priced corporate attorney who had always orbited Eleanor's wealth with a hungry look. Charles carried a thick leather briefcase, his face set in a mask of practiced, professional detachment. Arthur remained seated, his hands wrapped around his cooling cup of tea. He watched the three men position themselves around his small desk like predators circling a wounded animal. Charles cleared his throat and opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of legal documents. He stated that they needed to discuss the practical matters of Eleanor's estate immediately to avoid any unnecessary complications. He spoke rapidly, using dense legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate. Tom leaned against the bookshelf, his arms still crossed. He added that they knew this was a difficult time, but the business required immediate leadership and the assets needed to be secured. His voice dripped with synthetic sympathy, a sharp contrast to the coldness in his eyes. Arthur placed his teacup carefully on the desk. He waited in silence for them to drop the axe. Charles adjusted his expensive tie and began reading from a thick document that he claimed was Eleanor's final will. The terms were brutally clear and breathtakingly cruel. The $2.5 million mansion in Weston, the very house Arthur had maintained and loved for over 2 decades, was to be transferred exclusively to Rick and Tom. The luxurious $1.5 million vacation estate in Cape Cod was also left entirely to the brothers. And the supply chain company, the massive empire Eleanor had built with Arthur's quiet, steadfast support behind the scenes, was to be divided solely between her 2 biological sons. Arthur listened as 25 years of marriage and sacrifice were coldly erased in a matter of minutes. He was being stripped of his home, his security, and his entire life. Then came the final, devastating blow. Charles pulled out a separate, smaller folder. He explained with a completely straight face that Eleanor's extensive medical treatments during her final months had accumulated a massive outstanding debt. The bills totaled $300,000. Rick stated smoothly that since Arthur was her husband and the primary person making her daily medical decisions, those debts were legally considered his personal responsibility. Tom added a fake, pitying smile. He told Arthur not to worry completely, because Eleanor had left him a life insurance policy of $50,000 to help cover his transition. $50,000 to start over. $300,000 in crushing medical debt. And absolutely zero assets. It was a financial death sentence for a retired teacher. Rick watched Arthur closely, clearly expecting an explosive reaction. He wanted the old man to scream, to cry, to threaten legal action. He wanted an excuse to unleash the ruthless legal team he had waiting in the wings to crush Arthur into dust. But Arthur did not scream. He did not cry. His face remained a perfectly calm, unreadable mask. The intense patience that had defined his entire life settled over him like a heavy armor. He looked deeply into Rick's eyes, then shifted his gaze to Tom. Arthur simply asked, his voice steady and soft, if this was truly their mother's wish. Rick did not even flinch. He confidently replied that their mother always intended for the family assets to stay strictly within the bloodline. He emphasized the word bloodline like a weapon, reminding Arthur that despite raising them, he would always be nothing more than an outsider. Tom pushed off the bookshelf and stepped forward. He stated that they were not heartless monsters. They had agreed to be generous and give Arthur 30 days to pack his personal belongings and vacate the Weston property. 30 days to completely erase his existence from the family. Charles slid a preliminary acknowledgement form across the desk, handing Arthur a heavy gold pen. The lawyer expected hesitation, perhaps a plea for more time or a demand to consult an independent attorney. Instead, Arthur took the pen. He looked at the document that effectively ruined his financial future. A deep, silent realization washed over him. Eleanor would never have written a will like this. She loved him deeply. This document was either a heavily manipulated older version or an outright forgery constructed by her greedy sons. But fighting them directly now, with zero resources against their high-powered lawyers, would be suicide. Without a single word of protest, Arthur signed the acknowledgement. Rick and Tom exchanged a quick, victorious look. Their eyes gleamed with absolute triumph. They thought the old man was broken, too weak and exhausted from grief to put up a fight. They believed they had just executed the perfect theft. They had no idea that by accepting their cruel judgment so easily, Arthur had just laid the first brick of their total destruction. As they turned and strutted out of the study with the signed paper, Arthur sat alone in the quiet room. The sadness in his heart was slowly being replaced by something much colder and far more dangerous. The clock was ticking on the 30 days Arthur had been given to erase 25 years of his life. The following afternoon, the sprawling Weston mansion felt more like a tomb than a home. Arthur began the painful process of packing his modest belongings. He moved quietly through the quiet halls, folding faded sweaters and boxing up his old teaching books. The sheer injustice of his situation pressed heavily on his chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. He paused by the large bay window in the second-floor hallway. Down below, on the manicured stone patio, a celebration was underway. Rick and Tom were lounging on the expensive outdoor furniture, laughing loudly as they drank glasses of vintage champagne. Chloe, Tom's status-obsessed wife, was busy taking pictures of the expansive gardens, already discussing loud plans to tear out Eleanor's prized rose bushes to build a massive luxury pool. They were toasting to their newfound wealth, celebrating their mother's death and their stepfather's ruin with absolute shamelessness. The sight sent a bitter chill down Arthur's spine. Unable to watch any longer, Arthur turned away and slowly walked into the master suite he had shared with Eleanor. The room still carried the faint, lingering scent of her favorite floral perfume. He approached her elegant antique dressing table, intending to carefully pack away her personal letters before the boys could throw them in the trash. As he emptied the heavy oak drawers, Arthur noticed something strange about the bottom compartment. The depth inside did not match the exterior frame. He ran his fingers along the smooth wood, his instincts suddenly sharpening. He pressed firmly against the back panel. A faint click echoed in the quiet room. The bottom board popped up, revealing a hidden, velvet-lined compartment. Arthur held his breath as he reached inside. His fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. He pulled out an antique brass key. Stamped into the side of the metal were the words First National Bank. Beneath the key lay a single, neatly folded piece of expensive stationery. Arthur recognized his wife's elegant, flowing handwriting immediately. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the thick paper. The message was devastatingly brief, yet it carried the weight of an entire lifetime of love and brilliant strategy. It read, "For the most patient husband in the world. Do not trust them." Arthur stared at the ink. The words seemed to burn brightly against the white paper. In that single, breathtaking moment, the crushing despair that had paralyzed him since the funeral completely evaporated. The suffocating doubt was gone. Eleanor had not abandoned him. She had not let her greedy sons cast him out into the cold with nothing but crushing debt. She had known exactly what Rick and Tom were capable of, and she had prepared for it. Arthur looked back toward the window, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter drifting up from the garden. They thought they had successfully manipulated a grieving, weak old man. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. A slow, quiet smile touched the corners of Arthur's mouth. His profound sadness vanished, completely replaced by a terrifying, razor-sharp clarity. He carefully tucked the brass key and the note deep into his pocket. He did not know what was waiting for him at the bank, but he knew one thing for certain. His legendary patience was no longer a weakness. It was a weapon, and he was finally ready to use it. Early the next morning, long before the estate awoke, Arthur drove his modest sedan to downtown Boston. The heavy stone architecture of First National Bank felt imposing, but Arthur walked through the grand double doors with a newly forged sense of purpose. He presented the antique brass key to the vault manager. The manager, a discreet older woman, recognized the key immediately and guided Arthur down into the silent, heavily guarded subterranean vault. In the privacy of a small, windowless viewing room, Arthur sat alone with a large steel deposit box resting on the table before him. He took a slow, deep breath and lifted the heavy lid. The box was packed to the brim with thick manila folders, financial ledgers, and a stack of crisp envelopes. Resting at the very top was a thick envelope with his name written in Eleanor's elegant script. Arthur opened it carefully. The letter inside was long, written with a steady hand that betrayed no sign of her final illness. Eleanor began by apologizing. She begged for his forgiveness for keeping such massive secrets during her final year, explaining that she needed absolute airtight security to protect him. She wrote that she had always known exactly how ruthless and greedy Rick and Tom were. She had watched them circle her like vultures as her health declined, plotting to steal the company and cast Arthur aside. Eleanor explained that she could never let the two men she had birthed destroy the one man who had truly loved her. Arthur set the letter down, his vision blurring slightly before he blinked the moisture away. He reached back into the box and pulled out a blue folder labeled Trust Assets. Inside were statements from an offshore banking institution. Arthur stared at the final balance, his mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the number. $8 million. It was entirely in liquid cash, sitting safely in an ironclad international trust established exclusively in his name. Eleanor had spent her final months quietly liquidating her shadow shares and private investments, moving the massive fortune completely out of the reach of her sons and their greedy lawyers. Arthur was not a penniless widow. He was a millionaire several times over. But Eleanor had left him more than just money. She had left him ammunition. The next folder was thick and bound with black tape. It contained the results of a year-long private investigation Eleanor had secretly commissioned. The contents painted a sickening picture of her two sons. There were high-resolution photographs and heavily documented financial trails proving that Rick was not a successful hedge fund manager, but a desperate gambling addict. Rick had forged his own mother's signature to secure massive loans from dangerous, underground creditors. Tom was no better. The files contained irrefutable proof that Tom's flashy tech startup was nothing more than a sophisticated fraud. Tom had been systematically defrauding elderly investors, draining their retirement funds to pay for Chloe's designer wardrobe and their extravagant lifestyle. Both brothers were staring down the barrel of severe federal prison time if these documents ever saw the light of day. At the very bottom of the steel box lay the final, most crucial document. It was a pristine, legally flawless will, dated just weeks before Eleanor passed away. The document had been drawn up and secured by Sarah Jenkins, a secretive and highly powerful attorney Arthur had never met. The terms of this real will were breathtaking. It stated that all decisions regarding the inheritance of the Weston Mansion, the Cape Cod estate, and the supply chain company were left entirely to the absolute discretion of Arthur Pendleton. Eleanor had not just protected him. She had handed him the sword, the shield, and the final judgment. Arthur carefully packed the devastating documents back into the box, taking only what he needed and locking it securely. When he walked back out into the bustling Boston sunlight, he was no longer a victim. He was the architect of a spectacular ruin, and he knew exactly how to spring the trap. Arthur navigated the labyrinth of Boston traffic, his mind buzzing with the magnitude of his discoveries. He arrived at an understated brick building tucked away on a quiet street in the financial district. There was no flashy signage, only a small brass plaque bearing the name Sarah Jenkins. This was the woman Eleanor had trusted with her final, most devastating secrets. Arthur was ushered into a modest, wood-paneled office. Sarah Jenkins stood up from behind her desk to greet him. She was a woman in her late 40s, possessing a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing. She did not wear a $10,000 suit like Charles Sterling. She did not need to project false power. She was the genuine article. Sarah offered Arthur a firm handshake and directed him to a comfortable leather chair. She expressed her deepest condolences, telling Arthur that Eleanor had spoken of him with a profound, almost fierce kind of love. Hearing those words from a stranger solidified the warmth that had finally returned to Arthur's heart. Sarah then opened a thick, highly classified file on her desk. She stated that since Arthur had found the safety deposit box, he already knew about the offshore trust and criminal files detailing the horrific actions of his stepsons. But, Sarah noted, there was a final piece to Eleanor's grand design. She spread a series of highly complex financial documents across the polished desk. Sarah explained that Eleanor knew Rick and Tom would never be satisfied with just a portion of the estate. Their blinding greed would compel them to try and take everything. So, Eleanor decided to give them exactly what they lusted after, but she fundamentally altered the nature of the prize. Sarah pointed to the documents detailing the status of the Weston Mansion and the Cape Cod vacation home. Rick and Tom firmly believed these properties were owned free and clear, representing millions in pure equity. However, during her final year, Eleanor had quietly utilized her massive corporate influence to completely leverage the real estate. She had taken out exorbitant, high-interest commercial mortgages against both homes. Furthermore, she had systematically drained the operational capital of the supply chain company, securing massive private loans against its future revenue. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes scanning the endless rows of numbers converted into staggering liabilities. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The properties and the business were no longer assets. They were a carefully disguised financial black hole. Sarah explained the brutal math. The total debt securely attached to the physical assets vastly exceeded their actual market value by over $2 million. Whoever inherited the estate and the business would not be inheriting a fortune. They would be inheriting an immediate, crushing obligation to ruthless corporate creditors. The probate process was currently holding the creditors at bay, Sarah clarified. But the very second the legal transfer of those specific assets was finalized and signed, the massive loans would immediately become due and payable by the new owners. Sarah folded her hands on the desk and looked Arthur directly in the eye. She told him that he held absolute power. As the sole beneficiary of the authentic will, he could simply walk into a courtroom tomorrow. He could publicly produce the real will, claim the entire estate, and hand the criminal dossiers over to the federal authorities. Rick and Tom would be instantly ruined, arrested for their individual frauds, and Arthur could retire in absolute peace. Arthur sat back in his chair, staring out the window at the bustling city below. He considered the easy path. He could crush them legally and swiftly. But the image of Rick and Tom laughing on the patio, casually discarding 25 years of his life, burned like acid in his memory. They had treated him like an insect to be crushed beneath their expensive Italian shoes. They were deeply arrogant, believing themselves to be untouchable masters of the universe. Simply sending them to jail would allow them to play the victim. It would not shatter their colossal egos. Eleanor had spent her dying days meticulously crafting this trap, not just for justice, but for a perfectly tailored, poetic retribution. Arthur turned his gaze back to Sarah. His face was a picture of absolute serenity, but his voice was as cold and sharp as a scalpel. He told the attorney that they would not go to court. They would not reveal the authentic will or the criminal evidence. Sarah raised an inquiring eyebrow, asking what he intended to do instead. Arthur stated that he was going to play the exact role his stepsons demanded of him. He would continue to be the weak, grieving, defeated old man. He would let them feel the absolute, intoxicating thrill of total victory. He would let them demand the estate, the houses, and the company with their usual suffocating arrogance. And then, Arthur said with a chillingly calm smile, he would look them dead in the eye and voluntarily give them absolutely everything they wanted. He would hand them the keys to their own destruction, and he would let them eagerly swallow the poison their mother had so brilliantly prepared. Sarah Jenkins leaned back in her chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. She recognized the terrifying perfection of the plan. She nodded her agreement, promising to prepare the specific transfer documents that would legally lock the brothers into the debt. Arthur stood up, thanking her for her time. The trap was completely armed and waiting. He just needed to invite the wolves to their final feast. The trap was set, and Arthur did not have to wait long for his prey to walk willingly into it. That very evening, his phone vibrated with a message from Tom. It was an invitation to a private family dinner at Tom and Chloe's sprawling penthouse apartment overlooking the Boston skyline. The message was dripping with fake affection, claiming they wanted to share a quiet meal to honor Eleanor's memory and discuss how to make his transition out of the Weston mansion as painless as possible. Arthur accepted immediately. When Arthur stepped out of the private elevator and into the penthouse, he was immediately struck by the suffocating display of unearned wealth. The apartment was a monument to Tom's fraudulent tech startup, decorated with imported marble, abstract art that cost more than most people earned in a decade, and a crystal chandelier that caught the city lights. Chloe greeted him at the door wearing a designer silk dress. She wrapped her arms around Arthur in a tight, entirely theatrical hug, her heavy perfume almost masking the scent of the expensive catered dinner she was pretending to have cooked herself. Rick was already there, lounging on a custom white leather sofa. He held a glass of scotch, his leg bouncing with an anxious, nervous energy. Rick was in deep trouble with his underground creditors, and his impatience to get his hands on the estate was practically radiating from his pores. Arthur shuffled into the living room, deliberately sloping his shoulders and slowing his steps. He wore an old, oversized sweater, playing the part of a broken, exhausted widower to absolute perfection. They moved to the grand dining table. Throughout the first course, the atmosphere was thick with synthetic sympathy. Chloe offered him more wine, while Tom spoke softly about how much they all missed Eleanor. Arthur nodded slowly, keeping his eyes downcast, eating his food with the trembling hands of an old man crushed by grief. He let them feel completely in control. As the main course was cleared, Rick finally dropped the grieving son act. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table, and shifted the conversation to business. Rick smoothly suggested that since Arthur was clearly exhausted, they should expedite the legal paperwork. He explained that their attorney, Charles Sterling, had prepared a simple waiver. If Arthur signed it, he would be completely freed from the burden of the probate process, the massive estate taxes, and the $300,000 in medical debt. Rick painted the waiver as a generous gift, a way for Arthur to walk away cleanly and start his new life with the $50,000 insurance policy. Tom chimed in, his voice oozing with false concern. He told Arthur that navigating corporate assets and estate law was far too stressful for someone his age. Tom insisted that he and Rick were strong enough to carry the heavy burden of the company and the properties. Arthur took a slow sip of his water. He looked at the two brothers, his expression perfectly blank. Then, he tilted his head slightly, furrowing his brow as if struggling to remember something trivial. He spoke quietly, his voice slightly raspy. He mentioned that while he was packing Eleanor's office, he had stumbled across some highly confusing financial papers. Arthur blinked innocently, looking directly at Rick. He asked if either of them knew anything about commercial mortgages. He added that he saw some documents mentioning massive loans tied to the Weston mansion and the Cape Cod estate, and he was worried about what that meant for the family. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Rick choked on his scotch, coughing violently into his napkin. Tom froze, his face suddenly turning the color of ash. Chloe dropped her silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a loud clatter. Panic flashed wildly in the eyes of the two brothers. They had absolutely no idea that the properties were leveraged. In their arrogant rush to steal the assets, they had completely skipped the essential step of demanding an independent financial audit. The very mention of mortgages terrified them, planting a tiny seed of doubt that their golden inheritance might have a complication. Tom was the first to recover. He forced a wide, completely unconvincing smile and waved his hand dismissively. He assured Arthur that those documents were probably just old, outdated paperwork from decades ago when their mother was first expanding the business. Tom smoothly lied, insisting that Eleanor owned everything free and clear. He leaned in close, his voice taking on a patronizing, soothing tone, explicitly telling Arthur to stop worrying his tired mind over complex corporate jargon. Rick quickly backed his brother up, his voice tight. He forcefully reiterated that Arthur needed to leave the heavy lifting to the professionals. Rick stated that Charles Sterling would handle all the boring financial details, and all Arthur needed to do was sign the waiver so he could rest. Arthur watched them sweat. He saw the sheer terror hiding behind their greedy eyes. They were so desperate to claim their prize that they were willing to aggressively gaslight him to keep him compliant. They were actively talking themselves into the very trap he had set. Arthur let out a long, heavy sigh, as if a great weight had been lifted from his weary shoulders. He offered them a weak, grateful smile. He told them they were absolutely right. He confessed that he was simply too old and too tired to fight over money or understand complicated bank statements. He explicitly promised that he would not contest the will, and he would not dig into Eleanor's paperwork ever again. The visible relief that washed over Rick and Tom was almost comical. Their shoulders dropped, and they exchanged a triumphant, arrogant smirk. They truly believed they had successfully manipulated the old fool away from the edge of discovering their secrets. Arthur then calmly promised to meet them at Charles Sterling's office the following morning to sign everything away, exactly as they wished. Chloe clapped her hands in delight, immediately offering dessert. Arthur politely declined, citing his exhaustion. As Tom walked into the elevator, patting him on the back with fake affection, Arthur kept his head bowed. He stepped into the elevator, and as the doors slid shut, blocking the brothers from view, the frail, confused old man instantly vanished. Arthur stood tall, his eyes cold and sharp. The wolves were hungry, and tomorrow, he would serve them the feast. Early the next morning, the sky over Boston was a heavy, overcast gray. Inside the sleek, glass-walled offices of Charles Sterling, the atmosphere was thick with mounting panic. Rick and Tom had arrived hours before the scheduled meeting with Arthur, eager to begin the preliminary transfers of Eleanor's massive liquid assets. They stood behind Charles as the expensive attorney typed rapidly on his keyboard, attempting to access the primary corporate and personal accounts at First National Bank. Instead of screens displaying millions of dollars in available cash, the portal continuously returned bright red error messages. The accounts were empty. The corporate operational capital was gone. The personal cash reserves Eleanor used to maintain the Weston mansion had completely vanished. Rick slammed his hand against the desk, demanding an explanation. Charles wiped sweat from his forehead, his professional composure cracking. He explained that according to the digital banking logs, millions of dollars in liquid assets had been legally withdrawn and transferred to a completely blind offshore entity months before Eleanor passed away. The money was untouchable, entirely outside the jurisdiction of the current probate process. Tom felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The liquid cash was the safety net. It was the immediate money Rick desperately needed to pay off his violent underground creditors, and the funds Tom planned to use to silence his angry tech investors. Without the cash, they only had the physical properties and the company infrastructure. Rick's mind raced. He remembered Arthur's confusing questions at dinner the previous night regarding bank statements and complex paperwork. A furious, paranoid thought ignited in Rick's brain. He convinced himself that the old, deceitful widower had somehow manipulated their dying mother into signing over the cash reserves while she was heavily medicated. Rick pulled out his phone and frantically dialed Arthur's number. Miles away, Arthur was sitting comfortably in the spacious back seat of a luxury town car hired by Sarah Jenkins. Sarah sat beside him, reviewing a pristine stack of legal documents. When Arthur's phone began to vibrate, he looked at the caller identification. It was Rick. Arthur offered a knowing, serene smile to Sarah before answering the call. Rick did not offer a greeting. He screamed into the receiver, his voice echoing with absolute desperation and rage. He accused Arthur of grand larceny, demanding to know where the liquid funds were hidden and threatening to call the federal authorities immediately. Arthur held the phone slightly away from his ear, allowing Rick to completely exhaust his furious tirade. When Rick finally paused to take a breath, Arthur responded with the weak, trembling voice of an utterly bewildered old man. Arthur stated that he had absolutely no idea what Rick was talking about. He reminded his stepson that he was merely a retired high school teacher, a man who had never managed anything more complicated than a modest checking account. Arthur softly insisted that he had no access to offshore accounts or missing millions. He pleaded with Rick to calm down, reiterating that he just wanted to sign the papers and find peace. Tom snatched the phone from his brother. His voice was frantic, demanding that Arthur bring every single piece of paper, every key, and every bank token from the Weston mansion to the meeting immediately. Arthur replied with perfect, gentle compliance. He assured Tom that he was bringing everything necessary to finalize the transfer. Then, Arthur added a small, seemingly innocent detail. He mentioned that he had asked a friend, a very modest local attorney, to accompany him to the meeting. Arthur explained that he just wanted someone to help him understand the complicated legal jargon before he signed away his rights to the estate. The line went dead silent for a moment. The mention of another lawyer briefly spiked Tom's anxiety. But their blinding arrogance quickly took over. Tom covered the microphone and whispered to Rick that Arthur was bringing some cheap, small-town lawyer who would be completely out of his depth against Charles Sterling. They agreed that while the missing cash was a massive problem, the Weston mansion, the Cape Cod estate, and the supply chain company were still physically there. They calculated that the real estate and the corporate brand alone were worth tens of millions of dollars on paper. They decided they would force Arthur to sign the properties over today, and they would hunt down the missing cash tomorrow. Tom returned to the call, his voice dripping with forced patience. He told Arthur that bringing a friend was perfectly fine, as long as it did not delay the signing. He firmly instructed Arthur to hurry to the office. Arthur ended the call and placed his phone back into his pocket. The town car pulled to a smooth stop in front of the towering glass skyscraper that housed Charles Sterling's law firm. Arthur turned to Sarah Jenkins. His posture straightened, the fragile old man act completely shedding away. He smoothed the lapels of his suit, his eyes sharp and completely fearless. The pieces were perfectly arranged on the board. The final act of Eleanor's brilliant masterpiece was about to begin. The heavy glass doors of Charles Sterling's conference room swung open. Rick and Tom stood up immediately, their expressions a mix of lingering anxiety and aggressive greed. They expected Arthur to shuffle in alone, broken and ready to surrender. Instead, Arthur walked in with his head held high, his step steady and purposeful. Right beside him walked Sarah Jenkins. She wore a sharp-tailored suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase, radiating an aura of absolute authority that instantly made Charles Sterling shift uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. Rick sneered, looking Sarah up and down. He demanded to know who this woman was, assuming she was the cheap local lawyer Arthur had mentioned on the phone. Sarah did not wait for an introduction. She walked straight to the polished mahogany table, bypassed the seats offered to them, and opened her briefcase. She placed a pristine, legally bound document directly in front of Charles Sterling. She introduced herself clearly and coldly. She stated that she was the primary legal counsel for the late Eleanor Pendleton. Charles Sterling let out a condescending laugh. He tapped the thick file on his desk, claiming that he had represented the Pendleton family for over a decade and held the only valid will. Sarah did not smile. She instructed Charles to look at the date and the notary seal on the document she had just provided. The room fell completely silent as Charles opened the folder. His arrogant smirk vanished instantly. The color drained from his face until he looked positively sick. He stared at the signature, the official stamps, and the date. It was executed just 3 weeks before Eleanor passed away, completely overriding the older document Charles possessed. Eleanor had secretly fired him and bypassed his firm entirely. Tom stepped forward, his voice trembling with sudden panic. He asked Charles what the document said. Charles swallowed hard, unable to look his clients in the eye. He admitted that the new will was perfectly legal. He explained that Eleanor had left the entire estate, the properties, the business, and all liquid assets entirely to Arthur. Arthur possessed sole, absolute discretion over whether Rick and Tom would inherit a single penny. Rick erupted. He screamed that it was a forgery. He lunged toward the table, his face purple with rage, accusing Arthur of manipulating a dying woman. He threatened to tie the estate up in litigation for the next 20 years. Arthur raised a single, calm hand. The gesture was so steady, so completely devoid of fear, that it actually stopped Rick in his tracks. Arthur looked at the two brothers. His voice was soft, carrying the gentle tone of the patient teacher he had always been. He told them to calm down. He said he remembered their conversation from the day of the funeral. He remembered that they wanted the Weston Mansion, the Cape Cod estate, and the supply chain company. He stated that he had thought very long and hard about their words, about family and bloodlines. Arthur looked deep into Rick's furious eyes and said he was not there to fight. He was there to respect their mother's legacy. He announced that he was completely willing to sign a legally binding deed of gift, transferring absolute ownership of the mansion, the vacation home, and the entire corporate entity directly to the two of them, right then and there. The sheer shock in the room was palpable. Rick and Tom froze, their anger instantly evaporating into stunned disbelief. They had been ready for a brutal, drawn-out legal war, and instead, the old man was simply handing them the keys to the kingdom. Sarah Jenkins pulled a thick transfer agreement from her briefcase. She laid it on the table alongside a sleek black pen. She stated that the document would execute Arthur's wishes, transferring the specified physical and corporate assets immediately and irrevocably to Rick and Tom. Blinded by their astronomical greed and the sudden, overwhelming relief of victory, the brothers did not hesitate. They did not ask to read the massive addendum attached to the back of the deed. They did not ask Charles Sterling to review the complex legal jargon detailing the exact nature of the transferred assets. They simply saw the finish line of their long, ruthless scheme. Rick snatched the pen first, his hands shaking with pure adrenaline as he scrawled his signature across the line. Tom practically ripped the pen from his brother's grip, signing his own name with a triumphant flourish. They stepped back, exchanging a look of absolute ecstasy. They had done it. They were the undisputed kings of the Pendleton Empire. They smiled in triumph, waiting for Arthur to finally pack his bags and disappear forever. But Arthur did not move. He simply reached into his pocket, retrieved his glasses, and waited for the poison to take effect. The ink on the transfer agreement was barely dry when the celebratory atmosphere in the room completely shattered. Rick and Tom stood grinning at each other, clutching the document that they believed made them untouchable kings. Arthur slowly folded his reading glasses and slid them into his breast pocket. He reached out and gently pulled the thick addendum from the back of the transfer packet, sliding it across the polished mahogany table toward Charles Sterling. Arthur suggested, his voice barely above a whisper, that Charles might want to read the liability assumption clause to his clients. Charles frowned, his professional pride already wounded, and picked up the paper. As his eyes scanned the dense legal text, his face turned the color of chalk. He looked up at Rick and Tom, his mouth opening and closing without any sound. Rick snapped, demanding to know what was wrong. Sarah Jenkins did not give Charles the chance to explain. She stood up and delivered the executioner's blow with absolute precision. She announced that by signing the transfer, Rick and Tom had legally bypassed the protective bubble of the probate process. They had just assumed immediate, total personal responsibility for all encumbrances attached to the assets. Sarah listed the debts with surgical coldness. The Weston mansion carried a $3 million commercial mortgage. The Cape Cod estate held a $2 million lien. The supply chain company was drowning under $5 million in high-interest corporate loans. She explained that Eleanor had collateralized absolutely everything to the maximum limit. Rick and Tom had not inherited an empire. They had just voluntarily signed over their lives to $10 million of immediate, unpayable debt. The silence that followed was deafening. The triumphant smiles melted off the brothers' faces, replaced by a horror so profound it seemed to completely paralyze them. Rick staggered backward, hitting the edge of the conference table. He gasped for air, screaming that it was a trick and they would simply void the signatures. Sarah shook her head slowly. She stated that the documents were irrevocable and legally binding. But she was not finished. She reached into her sleek briefcase and pulled out two thick, black folders. She tossed them onto the center of the table with a heavy thud. She looked directly at Rick, explaining that the first folder contained irrefutable proof of his forged signatures and his massive debts to violent underground gambling syndicates. She then turned her sharp gaze to Tom, stating that the second folder detailed every single fraudulent wire transfer from his fake technology startup, proving he had stolen millions from elderly investors. Sarah calmly informed them that copies of these files were already prepared to be sent to the federal authorities and their respective creditors the moment Arthur gave the word. Total, absolute devastation finally hit the room. The towering arrogance of the two brothers shattered into a million pieces. The illusion of their wealth and power was completely gone, leaving only two desperate, terrified criminals facing decades in federal prison and immediate financial ruin. Rick's legs gave out. He collapsed into a leather chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, letting out a raw, pathetic sob. Tom spun around, his eyes wild with sheer panic. He grabbed his older brother by the collar of his expensive suit, screaming and spitting with rage. Tom blamed Rick for rushing the paperwork, accusing him of being a reckless addict who had dragged them both into hell. Rick shoved Tom away violently, screaming back that Tom was nothing but a pathetic fraud who could not even satisfy his greedy wife without stealing from retirees. In a matter of seconds, the united front they had built to destroy their stepfather had completely dissolved into a vicious, animalistic brawl. Tom screamed that Chloe was going to leave him, that he would be homeless, blaming Rick for everything. They suddenly stopped, turning their desperate eyes back to Arthur. They scrambled toward him, their pride completely forgotten. Tom fell to his knees, begging Arthur to tear up the contract, pleading for mercy. Rick pleaded just as hard, promising to give Arthur anything he wanted, begging the man he had tormented for decades to save his life. Arthur looked down at them. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was also absolutely no pity. The profound patience that had defined his entire life was completely gone. His voice was deep, resonant, and as cold as ice. He told them that for 25 years, he had tried to teach them about gratitude, humility, and family. He had endured their insults and their cruelty because he loved their mother. But Eleanor had understood their true nature far better than he ever did. Arthur looked at the crying, broken men on the floor. He stated clearly that this was not a trick. This was their inheritance. This was the exact legacy they had earned through their own boundless greed. Without another word, Arthur turned his back on them. He walked out of the glass doors alongside Sarah Jenkins, leaving Rick and Tom screaming in the ruins of the empire they had tried to steal. 6 months after that fateful meeting in the glass conference room, the dust had completely settled. The spectacular collapse of Rick and Tom made headlines in the local financial news. Overwhelmed by $10 million of immediate debt, the brothers had been forced to declare total bankruptcy. The Weston Mansion and the Cape Cod estate were swiftly foreclosed upon and auctioned off by the banks. The supply chain company was completely liquidated to satisfy the aggressive commercial creditors. But the financial ruin was only the beginning of their punishment. True to her word, Sarah Jenkins had handed the black folders over to the federal authorities. Both brothers were indicted and were now awaiting trial, facing years in federal prison for grand larceny, wire fraud, and embezzlement. Chloe, discovering that the luxurious lifestyle was permanently over, packed her designer bags and filed for divorce the very next morning, leaving Tom completely alone in the ashes of his own arrogance. Arthur Pendleton did not stay in Massachusetts to watch them fall. He took the $8 million from the offshore trust and moved south. He purchased a beautiful, sunlit farm in Asheville, North Carolina, paying entirely in cash. He traded the suffocating pressure of high society for the quiet peace of the rolling mountains. Arthur spent his days tending to a vibrant garden, finally breathing free air. He did not hoard the massive wealth Eleanor had left him. Instead, he used the vast majority of the funds to establish a massive charitable organization. He named it the Eleanor Pendleton Foundation, dedicating the money to providing housing and full educational scholarships for orphan children. It was a beautiful, lasting legacy that honored the true spirit of the woman he loved, completely erasing the dark stain her biological sons had tried to leave behind. As Arthur sat on his porch, watching the golden sunset over the mountains, he realized the ultimate truth. His decades of quiet endurance had never been a sign of weakness. True love and self-sacrifice will always build an unshakable foundation. He learned that every ounce of patience has its absolute limit, but when that limit is reached, one does not need to become a monster to find justice. Sometimes, the most devastating, perfect revenge against those who try to destroy you is simply stepping away and living an incredibly brilliant, beautiful life. He knew that blinding greed would always, eventually, dig its own grave. Every story carries a powerful mirror to our own reality. The tale of Arthur and Eleanor reminds us that true wealth is not measured in sprawling mansions or corporate empires, but in loyalty, integrity, and the quiet strength of a patient heart. It shows us that treating people with cruel arrogance will ultimately lead to total ruin. We hope this story touched your heart. If you want to listen to many more fascinating and emotional videos every single day, please hit the subscribe button, like, and share this video with your friends and family. How did this story make you feel? Can you relate this to anything you have seen in your own real life? Have you ever witnessed a situation where patience triumphed over loud arrogance? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We truly want to listen to the feelings from the very bottom of your heart. We want to take a moment to wish everyone watching this video great health, a joyful life, and deep peace every single day. Thank you so much for your time. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.